Hi, everyone. Hello. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us here this afternoon. My name is Ken McLeish. I'm an assistant professor at the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society, and also the Department of Anthropology here at Vanderbilt. And I'm actually standing in for our friend and colleague, Jonathan Metzl, the director of MHS, who, due to circumstances beyond his control, was called away to an extremely urgent sports-related meeting in Kansas City tonight. And he is absolutely heartbroken to not be here with us. And actually, I say that in all sincerity because actually, those of you who are in Dr. Metzl's men's health class know very well his enthusiasm for this topic, and Derek Griffith and I certainly know from conversations that we've been having. I think basically for the last 2 years, we've been waiting to actually make this event happen, and are really excited to see it come to fruition. So Jonathan actually is indeed truly very sad to not be here. We're also really fortunate to be joined by some colleagues from across campus, Professor Claire King from Department of Communication Studies, and Professor Tyson Brown from Sociology. So I'm standing in Jonathan's stead just to give a few words of introduction and kind of context for what we're going to be talking about here today, and then each of the presenters, or each of the panelists as well as myself, is going to talk for about 10 to 12 minutes about our work, and we'll have the remainder of the time for Q&A. So the question that is organizing this discussion on men's health and the politics of masculinity is the way that Jonathan described it to me is why study men? Why study men's health? Why make this an interdisciplinary and sort of cross-curricular question that we think is so important? And one way to answer that question is with the response that when you study men, you are studying norms. And you are studying norms in the sense of those things which are apparently so sort of commonsensical and invisible that they are allowed to pass unremarked and unquestioned and unchallenged. And you're also studying things that are so blatantly visible that they likewise sort of don't necessarily occasion remark or questioning or critique, because we're just simply so accustomed to seeing them operate in our everyday lives, and this is especially the case in terms of health, where we can think about. If we're trying to objectify health problems, experiences of illness, prevalence of ill health, access to health and healthcare, and the basic assumptions about identity and population and social and cultural categories that we use to ask these questions really shape the kinds of answers and solutions and interventions that we're able to come up with when thinking about health and when thinking about social change and policy making. For the folks who are in my class, the Politics of Health class, this week we're reading Nancy Krieger's extremely interesting critique of epidemiology called "Has Anyone Seen the Spider?" It's a sort of a critique of the notion that we can just sort of straightforwardly and easily categorize and pinpoint individual sources of causation. And one of the things that Krieger wants us to think about is that we need to understand not only how causation works, but where categories come from in the first place. So if we want to say that men or masculinity or stereotypically male behaviors are the sources of pathology or dysfunction or illness, we need to understand what's making those categories, where those categories are coming from, and how they're being reproduced and practiced and experienced across a range of contexts, not just what happens when people fall ill, when they visit the doctors, or when they sort of show up in one or another form as part of population statistics. There are a range of theoretical and conceptual frames that we can use for thinking about this problem. Feminist critiques of gender roles and patriarchy, sociological critiques of hegemony, medical frameworks for isolating sources of illness and ill health and suffering. And all of these frames have their limits. But potentially, when we take them to their limits, and when we take them to their limits in the context of the kind of interdisciplinary conversation that we're able to have here today, we can begin to sort of take advantage of those limits to ask, to sort of continue to ask what remains to be questioned, what remains to be explored and investigated when it comes to issues of men and masculinity and health. So one of the main sort of paradoxes or figures that lies at the center of this study is the way that again folks in Jonathan's class and I think in my class at this point have also have all heard this this characterization or this problem, this sense that that many of the things that define masculinity in culturally stereotypical ways in the contemporary U.S. are also the things that make men sick, that hurt them, and that even kill them. So things like speeding or bad habits like smoking or drinking to excess, sort of cultural dispositions to toughness that mean not wanting to go to see the doctor. All of these things we understand according to kind of basic American cultural scripts as being strongly expressive of particular ideas about masculinity, but they are also they're also sort of potentially anathema to good health as it's conventionally constructed. And this is something that we see reflected in popular culture in a lot of ways, whether it's sort of stereotypical images of cool and tough masculinity, whether it's in really spectacular manifestations of something like Jackass, where we see really this just sort of the presumed indestructibility of the male body carried to a really almost absurd extreme. And so there's this very interesting tension going on between social norms and expectations when it comes to masculinity and sort of medical norms of what constitutes good health and well-being. And so that's I suggest that as just sort of one of the many kind of points of departure that we can think about for this conversation today, and trying to sort of make sense of why masculinity matters to broader questions about health and vice versa, and to also potentially sort of embrace this question in the spirit that it is something that can be altered or challenged or changed in ways that can potentially increase everyone's well-being, not just that of men. And I know Jonathan would be very happy for me to suggest at this point that in a world where the Kansas City Royals can reach the World Series, it's impossible to imagine all kinds of novel and exciting change. And so in that spirit, I'll turn the floor over to our first presenter, Professor Derek Griffith.
Okay. Good afternoon. Wake up. Good afternoon. I know you're here. All right. Well, first, thanks to Ken for first standing in for Jonathan Stead, but also for that introduction and overview of sort of the general sort of topic of what we're going to talk about. Given the limited time that we have each, I decided I was going to change quite significantly sort of what I'm going to talk about. And what I'm going to talk about is pretty general, but really trying to highlight some of the challenges and some of basically the opportunities for linking masculinity and health. So a lot of times we assume that there is a relationship between the two, and we sort of go and approach this with this idea that hegemonic masculine norms, or basically these broad norms that we have of who men are supposed to be in society, are all basically the same and universal, and that they apply equally to all groups of men at the, basically throughout their life course, and regardless of who they are. And one of the things that I want to do is basically challenge that and suggest that there may be different ways that we would think about some of the pathways that get you from one to the other. Before I get too far into this, I do need to acknowledge the staff that work with me and that do all the hard work, and I get all the credit. Just kidding. But my staff that does a lot of the day-to-day, more practical work that I do in terms of doing a lot of the interventions, a lot of the research that we do in the Institute for Research on Men's Health, Dr. McKissick, who's the managing director, Emily, Tisa, and Lauren Brinkley-Rubenstein are all staff members or students that work with us to do a lot of the work that we do. Just as a point of departure as well, we know that regardless of whether you're talking about at birth or pretty much at any point in the life course, that men tend to live shorter lives than women, and that phenomena certainly cuts across racial and ethnic groups in the United States. So this is not terribly surprising to anyone here, I'm sure. We also know that maleness doesn't, despite its economic benefits, despite its sort of social power benefits, if you will, doesn't necessarily translate to longer life expectancy. And so that's one of sort of the paradoxes of men's health that we don't really have good explanations for. One of the other sort of basic issues that we sort of start with is that we have, and we typically assume and think about, if you think about it in the context of most health disparities or public health, that racial and ethnic disparities as well as socioeconomic disparities, that more power, more money, and so forth should lead to longer health and longer and better health. But we know that that's not the case, first in the context of men, and second of all, when we think about differences or disparities between economically different groups as well as racial and ethnically different groups, that when we think about those in relation to health, we usually have pretty broad and sophisticated explanations for why these disparities exist. We usually locate them somewhere in structural factors and forces, historical factors and context. We have these very rich, environmentally grounded, socially grounded sort of explanations for why these things happen. When we talk about men's health, we may not necessarily give it that kind of critical attention. And a lot of times we'll tend to focus on, well, these are just men just being men. And we'll give it a much more sort of short shrift sort of explanation that it has. First of all, it tends to locate the problem more within men themselves as opposed to it being something that may be a reflection of a societal or cultural phenomena norm. And that most of these differences basically boil down to men basically misbehaving in the context of these social and environmental expectations. The other thing that sort of is important, again, as by way of sort of foundation, there are different factors that contribute to men's poor health and shorter life expectancy. Some of them have to do with biological sex. Some of them have to do with factors related to gender. And a lot of them have to do with how the two come together to affect different physiological and biological pathways that connect basically the social experience of being men to the life experience as well as then the health outcomes of males themselves. And the challenge, and one of the things that I wanted to sort of focus on in my time, is simply that we don't really know very well how to better understand the relationship between sex, gender, and health. We don't have good explanations. We don't have good understandings of the mechanisms that connect these different factors. And so I want to sort of highlight a couple different places and possibilities at different levels that sort of help us think through some of those steps. We know that, first of all, health is not something that men in particular have been known to sort of see as a priority, that it's something that men in particular, but women do this as well, that they do after have achieving basically larger social and societal goals. So health is something that you treat as basically what's called more of an instrumental value, which is basically you do it to achieve something else. It's not like you basically are living your life to have on your tombstone, I lived a healthy life. You're living your life to achieve something else for someone else, and you're trying to achieve these larger goals that may have nothing to do with health. But we know that health gets in the way of your ability to do those things. And just as an example from some of the work that my team and I have done, we've had men talk about in focus groups health as being this sort of instrumental construct, as well as it being defined in relation to some of the roles and responsibilities they have in the lives of others. So being healthy in this first gentleman's context, being healthy to me is continuing to be able to be independent, being supportive, and being able to accomplish the things I put out. Or it's being able to perform 8 to 10 hours of labor and then being able to still have enough energy to do things with his family and so forth. So it's in this larger context that they're describing what health really means to them. Similarly, manhood is not something, or being male, first of all, has the context of age. So you hope upon hope that the way that you embody what being a man is at 18 is not the same thing that you do as a senior citizen. And that some of the things that you might do in college may be quite appropriate for college, but if your grandparents did them, you probably would cringe at best. So you kind of have to think about that, but the way that we've sort of operationalized what manhood looks like and the way that we typically measure it hasn't really taken that into account. So if you think about the measures of masculinity that we typically have just had one set of measures. So, and they were developed for basically on people who are sitting largely in this audience. So when you give it to grandpa, you sort of have this sort of, in a sort of technical sense, face valid sort of question about whether or not that's really the right measure to ask, or right set of questions to ask him to really understand who he is as a man. And so a lot of this is also related to the fact that men's health and masculinity and just being a man has to do a lot with the context and the goals that they have. And a lot of it has to do with, again, these larger things that people are trying to achieve, like having enough, being able to take care of responsibilities, take care of family, contribute to neighborhood, community, and other sort of identity groups that you may be a part of, or just social groups that you may be a part of. Again, regardless of all the changes that have happened in terms of certainly gender norms and so forth that have occurred over decades and so forth, for particularly men of color, providing or at least contributing economically to a household still remains a very core aspect of who they're expected to be, as well as who they see themselves as. So all of those have a lot to do with this idea of manhood and masculinity being both a relational construct and being something that you can't just understand just by looking at them in and of themselves. So when you get to this question of what is this relationship between manhood and health, there are different sort of ways to look at this, and I'm going to, in the interest of time, like I said, not really get into exceptional detail, but at least give you some flavor for different dimensions of this that we might consider. So clearly, as I already sort of illustrated one with age, that demographics play a big part in how men may embody different aspects of masculinity. What it looks like for Latino men may look very different for white men, may look very different for African American men. And so same thing with sexual identity and sexual orientation, that what it looks like for different groups may be very different in how it gets embodied, how it gets performed, and what it actually looks like as a set of goals and as a set of sort of aspirations. Social class is another one that we also see this play out a lot in terms of the different performance of masculinity, whether you're talking about in relation to health behaviors or you're talking about just in general. It's part of some of the explanation for why you see smoking rates being very different in lower income men versus men who actually have more education or more higher sort of levels of economic attainment. If you think about also other factors related to culture, religion, and so forth, all of those would play a part. You also have other sort of interpersonal or psychological characteristics. So the different belief systems that you have about both what it means to be a man, but also what it means in relation to the other identities that you have. So whether it's being a member of a military group, or whether or not it means that you have a particular job classification, whether it means that you are able-bodied or not. All of those things have a very different sense of who you are in terms of what it means to be a man and how you operationalize that, how you define that for yourself in relation to what you may see as an optimal sort of validation of what that means in relation to health. Interpersonal characteristics also would be that you're thinking about the peer groups that you're a part of, and that a lot of that, as you, I'm sure, see in sort of the peer norms that you have. So who are your friends and what they see as sort of appropriate for you to do, whether or not drinking is sort of the norm within your particular group or not, whether or not other kinds of behaviors that may be sort of normative within your smaller group, but may or may not be sort of normative within sort of the larger culture where you find yourself, also plays a part. And it's not just sort of your peer group and your family, but also can be the group that's sort of the object of your affection and sort of what that's supposed to look like. And so how those things kind of play out are also really important to think about as well. We sort of already alluded to this, but the way that men sort of, masculinity is considered a performance, meaning that it's a set of behaviors that tend to be the way that, it's not something that's static, like I do something today and I'm considered a man and I'm done. So I've established myself as a man, but it's something that you have to constantly sort of continue to demonstrate through your actions, through who you are, and through how you actually act on a daily basis. And so that a lot of times has a lot of implications or can be embodied in the different health behaviors or unhealthy behaviors you engage in, how you deal with stress or how you're expected to deal with stress, as well as how you connect with other males as just other people in your lives. So a lot of those all three of those are different ways that we have to sort of think about what masculinity means in relation to health. The last is basically a lot of the other things in relation to local history, context, and how again, you can look at these sort of as intersections with one another. So how your identity and who you are as a male and all the other things that sort of go into who you are, how that fits within the local context, history, politics, and formal policies of that environment where you are, both in relation to men as a large group, but also in relation to your racial and ethnic group and other things that are really salient to sort of who you are. The neighborhood environmental resources or lack thereof is a really important part of that as well. And just you have these other dimensions that really shape the environment where you are and help you understand sort of that context. And so all of those have really important and key dimensions that sort of help to understand this link between masculinity and health, and that also from the applied side of what I do are also different points of intervention. So if you think about the ways that we would intervene to try to improve men's health, you can improve the context where men live. You can you can try to change the social norms of the groups that they're part of. You can try to change how they would perform masculinity in relation to those norms and change sort of how they feel about potentially the need to, or the stress they may experience in trying to embody masculinity in a particular way or not. So the different things that you can do that speak to these different levels and layers and levels of masculinity that we were just talking about. So I will stop there, actually. Talk through.
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? All right, great. Well, I'm glad to see some familiar faces in the audience, and I'm excited to talk with you about this study that I'm working on with my graduate student, Taylor Hargrove, as well as Professor Griffith. And some of the concepts we're going to be talking about sort of follow on some of the topics that Professor Griffith just discussed, in that we start with the premise that both gender and race and their intersections matter for well-being. We also argue that while living in a patriarchal society carries a plethora of disadvantages for the health of women, gender as well as hegemonic norms of masculinity also carry negative implications for men, and that these negative implications may be they may be exacerbated among men of color. And so in this study, we're going to be looking at racial inequality in men's health, and we'll be testing a biopsychosocial model of racism as a stressor. So I'm just going to run through this study relatively quickly in order to save enough time for the following presenters and a discussion. So it should be about 10 minutes. So our research questions are twofold. First, are men of color exposed to disproportionately high levels of stressors compared to white men? And second, to what extent do SES, stressors, discrimination, and neighborhood conditions individually and collectively account for especially poor health among men of color relative to white men? And just a little bit of background on why we're studying this, and some of this follows on what Professor Griffith just mentioned. But we know that men of color tend to live sicker and die younger than in many other groups. And compared to white men, men of color experience worse health on an array of outcomes. We pick a number of outcomes, some of the most commonly measured in what we're looking at in this study. Think about self-rated health, sort of a global measure. Think about functional limitations, a measure of one's mobility, as well as allostatic load, which is sort of a biomarker of a number of components that measure sort of a global measure of dysregulation as a result of exposure to stress. I'm also interested in this from a humanistic perspective, first and foremost because of the unequal distribution of human suffering, right? From a pragmatic standpoint, this also carries a number of implications in that the annual costs of health disparities have been estimated to be at over $1 trillion per year in direct and indirect costs. And this study is among older adults, and a number of population trends suggest that this is increasingly important, one, because of the aging baby boom cohort, and two, because of the increasing racial and ethnic diversity of older adults that's projected to increase over the next several decades. So I'm going to be testing this, the biopsychosocial model of racism as a stressor, and which basically elucidates the psychosocial and biological pathways through which racism functions as a mechanism for perpetuating racial inequality in health. And so the experiences of racism ultimately lead to psychological or physiological stress responses that can oftentimes be exacerbated by socioeconomic and psychological factors and coping responses. And underlying premise is that perpetual stress responses to acute and chronically stressful conditions ultimately elevate one's vulnerability to disease, right? And so there's this chronic wear and tear as a result of reactions to stress. And so we argue that, as many others have argued, that stress is truly a primary mechanism by which inequality gets under the skin, right? And so you're all MHS, many MHS folks out here, so we're quite familiar with this paradigm. And we know that there's significant empirical evidence that suggests that physical health is affected by a number of types of stressors, right? And so the ones that we're going to be focusing on here, and that theory has pointed to in the past, is socioeconomic disadvantage. We can also think about acute and chronic stressors or eventful stressors, which we'll discuss more in a second, as well as discrimination stress, which disproportionately affects individuals in subordinate statuses, so racial and ethnic minorities and in other subordinate statuses, right? As well as segregation and other neighborhood conditions. So these all sort of combine to shape the unequal distribution of health in a population. And so the data we're going to use come from a nationally representative study. It's called the Health and Retirement Study. We've got just shy of 10,000 respondents, and the data that we used was collected in 2006 and 2008. And then the dependent variables that I mentioned before that we're going to be looking at here are self-rated health, functional limitations, and allostatic load. And I think we're all fairly well familiar with these measures. If not, then I'd be glad to answer questions about them at the end of the talk. And so when we got to the results, we found that there's actually a great deal of support for the differential exposure hypothesis. So namely, compared to white men, black and Hispanic men are exposed to more SES disadvantage, more stressors, more discrimination, and poor neighborhood conditions. And so a little bit of more detail about the specific measures that they included in this study. So for socioeconomic status, we noted that there were racial and ethnic inequality in education and household income and wealth. This has been, this is nothing new. We were aware of this before. Many studies have shown this. What is less known is empirical evidence on racial and ethnic inequalities in various types of stressors. And so we found that black and Latino men were exposed to more traumatic events, to more stressful life events, to financial strain, as well as chronic stress, which has been shown to be particularly deleterious for health outcomes over time. As well as discrimination stressors. And so we measured this in a number of ways, but ultimately we ended up including the typical measures, which are everyday measures of everyday discrimination and major discrimination. And then we also looked at neighborhood conditions, and we found that black and Latino men were disadvantaged relative to white men in terms of neighborhood disorder and cohesion. And I should just mention that all of these factors in the past have been shown to be predictive of health. Less research has been able to identify, empirically show that there are racial inequalities in some of these factors. Results also showed that the racial differences in SES, in discrimination, other stressors, and neighborhood conditions, individually and collectively, account for a substantial proportion of the racial inequality in men's health. And when we did a more fine-grained analysis, went back to some sensitivity analyses, we found that the strongest and most consistent mediators of health were socioeconomic resources, everyday discrimination, chronic stress, and neighborhood cohesion. So we took a number of things away from this study, which is actually still in progress. But first and foremost, the unequal access to socioeconomic resources, differential exposure to stressors, discrimination, and neighborhood conditions ultimately contribute to racial and ethnic disparities in health among men. Previous research has not, very limited research has looked at this, especially among men. And that we also take away from this that the unique disadvantages and challenges and expectations of men of color should be more seriously considered in future investigations of health disparities. This is understudied. Derek was mentioning that men's health in general has been understudied. Well, certainly the health of men of color has been studied even less, right? And there's a case to be made that we should be even looking at just within race, racial inequality as well, which I'm glad to talk about. But I think that there's some other takeaways from this also, which is that economic, social, and anti-discrimination policies are, in effect, health policies, right? And so sometimes when we're looking at these things, it can be a little bit discouraging. But I would argue that we can turn it on its head. And so if regressive policies have led to these health disparities, it stands to reason that progressive policies may be able to actually ameliorate some of these health disparities. Thank you. Bad. No, I'm not used to that.
Hello, how are you? Can you hear me? Good. I'm going to move and walk around. I don't have the advantage of height when it comes to a podium like this, so I figured rather than be hidden, I'll stand up here. My name is Claire Cisco-King. I'm an assistant professor in the Communication Studies Department, and I also teach in the Cinema and Media Arts program. I'm probably coming from a perspective quite different from what many of you are used to if you were primarily students in the MHS program. So I'm going to talk broadly about my interests and my approaches to the study of the topics of masculinity and health. And so in response to the question, why do I study men? My first response was to think, well, that I don't actually study men. I study representations of men and discourses about masculinity. My primary area of study has been popular cinema. So I study the kinds of films that, in most cases, typically get bad reviews but make lots of money. But I also study other forms of visual culture, including photojournalism, art, television, and increasingly I'm interested in all of the kinds of ancillary texts that surround the entertainment industry, so celebrity culture and social media. And I want to talk for a second about why it is I study these representations, why I'm interested in these kinds of sites that we often dismiss as simply entertainment, right? Just fun, just a way to pass the time. Broadly speaking, I'm interested in the politics of signification. And what I mean by that phrase is that I'm interested in what's at stake in the processes of making meaning in a text and interpreting meaning from a text. So what does it mean when we go to the movies and we watch a movie and we think we're just having a good time, but in fact we are taking away all kinds of ideas, all kinds of constructions that are significant for our own senses of identity and for our understandings of other people's places in the world. My focus on visual culture and popular cinema is particularly interested in representations of gender as it relates to sexuality. I want to say there are two primary reasons that I'm interested in the politics of signification. The first is that I think that the entertainment value that we take from movies is only a small part of what popular culture has to afford us. I think, in the words of one rhetorician, Kenneth Burke, that popular media texts act as equipment for living. So the movies that you watch, the television shows that you watch, the Tumblrs that you read, these texts become sites through which you make sense of the world around you, through which you negotiate and come to understand public narratives, right? Discourses about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a U.S. citizen, what it means to be able-bodied, right? All of these different parts of our identities get communicated to us through popular text. These become important sites where we understand and grapple with these possibilities. For the most part, I think that popular media tends to serve normative interests. In other words, popular texts tend to promote hegemonic versions of what it means to be masculine, for instance. But I also think that these sites can become important places where we can contest, where we can question, where we can challenge these normative iterations and try to open up space for new identifications such that it's not just certain versions of masculinity, white, heterosexual, able-bodied masculinity, for instance, that is privileged. Right? So this idea that media texts are equipment for living, for me, is part of the value of studying what I call signification, or the communication of meaning. I think also that this equipment that we turn to can become an important site for the creation of identifications. It can become an important site where we do our own work in terms of telling stories to ourselves about who we are, right, which allow us then to identify likenesses or similarities with other people, right, maybe even if they're only imagined. And so in that way, they allow us to create communities, to establish bonds of connection. But these sites can also become resources for disidentification, for determining what we're not, right? For determining who we are not, for creating lines of divisiveness, division, and separation, but also for the creation of hierarchies such that certain identities, certain subjectivities and bodies can be privileged over and against others. So this equipment for living allows us not only to live our own lives, but it also helps to create a political terrain, right, or a field of power relations where our lives are lived in relationship to other people. So I think that the act of engaging with media text, the act of being an audience member and a consumer and an interpreter has a real material impact on the way that we experience not only our own lives, but the way that other people are enabled to experience theirs. The second reason that I think that the politics of signification are important is because my understandings of gender and sexual identifications hinge on a concept that Professor Griffith mentioned earlier, which is this idea of performance. Drawing from the theories of Judith Butler, I understand gender and sexual identifications to be mimetic, which is to say they are imitative. As we construct our own senses of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be heterosexual, what it means to be bi, right? As we construct these parts of our identities, we construct these stories in part in relationship to stories that pre-exist us, to stories that are already extant, that are already existing. And we imitate them, we borrow from them, we cite them. And these performances congeal over time. We engage in them on an ongoing daily basis. And over time, they congeal into what Butler calls a sort of a substance, right? We get the idea that this is really who we are, that this is an innate or essential part of our identities. But in fact, rather than reflecting some inner psychic truth or some biological fact, these ideas, these identifications, come as the result of these ongoing engagements with other people, but also with cultural norms and cultural representations. So for me, I think about mediated texts. You can't really see the image here, but if you could, you'd see a shirtless, bloodied, sweaty Brad Pitt behind the words here from Fight Club. That representations like this play a significant role in giving us those resources, those citational or imitative resources from which we borrow in order to construct our senses of who we are, right? In order to enact the performances of our own identities. So I want to talk just for a few minutes then about a research project that I completed just a few years ago in my first book, just to give you a sense of what this kind of research looks like, what it means to study mediated masculinity, right, or media representations of masculinity, and to suggest ways in which this might be connected to health. And so I really do want to echo Professor McLeish's point that normative ideas about masculinity can have an impact on the material conditions of living, right? They can have an impact on embodied experience. And I'm particularly interested in a culture of film that promotes norms that, on the one hand, privilege certain identities associated with masculinity, right? Give certain versions of masculinity a kind of a hegemony in our society. At the same time that this culture is really detrimental to the lives and to the health of men. So my first book is really subtly titled Washed in Blood, because, you know, if you're going to write a book, you might as well give it a splashy title. If you could see a little better, maybe I can bring down the lights here. What you can kind of see is this is Charlton Heston floating in a pool of his own blood in a fountain. From the end of the scene, Omega Man. Anyone seen the film Omega Man? A couple of people. Anyone seen the film I Am Legend with Will Smith? If you've seen I Am Legend, you've seen a remake of Omega Man. But what I'm interested in Washed in Blood is a type of film, a body or a cycle of films that I call the sacrificial film, which are films that kill off their leading male protagonist. And these kinds of films are interesting to me because in one way they seem sort of counterintuitive. We typically think of the stereotypical Hollywood hero as being invulnerable, as being indestructible. But in fact, there are these bodies of films that tend to come in spates, right? They tend to come in cycles in particular moments of history that one after the other kill off their leading male protagonist. So just to throw out a few examples, The Exorcist is a film that does this. The Poseidon Adventure, Omega Man. These are all films from the late 1960s, early 1970s that I understand as responding to the culture and the discourses associated with Vietnam. Right? Films like Titanic, maybe anybody seen Titanic? Armageddon. These are films in the mid-1990s that again, force their leading male protagonists not just to the brink of death, but beyond it. More recently, I was interested in films from the mid-2000s, right around the 5th anniversary of 9/11, like Poseidon with Kurt Russell, which is a remake of the Poseidon Adventure, I Am Legend, which is, as I said, a remake of Omega Man. I should say at the outset, these are all pretty much really bad movies, so I take, I suppose, a kind of perverse pleasure in watching really bad movies. But in most of them, the scenario is relatively similar. The world is in crisis. Right, there is some form of disaster that's overtaken the land. In some cases, it's zombies. In other cases, it's biological warfare. In others, it's a sinking cruise liner. Right, but there is some sort of crisis in the world of the film story. And a man has been forced to the forefront to become the hero to solve the problem. But he is reluctant. He is typically wounded and suffering from a kind of psychological trauma. And in these films, what I'm interested in is the way that the idea of psychological trauma becomes a kind of organizing logic, not just within the films themselves, but within the larger cultural context at the time that we see these cycles recur in U.S. culture. So the idea of psychological trauma first originates with Freud, who takes the Greek word for wound, which is trauma, which referred to a physical wound, right, and starts to think about it in psychological terms in order to consider the idea that the psyche, right, that our mind could be injured, could be fragmented by an experience that shatters us, that undoes us. And psychological trauma typically registers with certain kinds of symptoms, including flashbacks, nightmares, hallucinations, repetition compulsions. So in all of these films, our leading male protagonists suffer from psychological trauma, what we might call PTSD in the current moment. But it's also the case that this frame of individual trauma or mental illness becomes applied to the larger cultural context, where the narrative suggests that it's not just the hero, but the entire collective, the nation, the society that is suffering from a kind of traumatic injury. And that often this traumatic injury comes in the form of a falling apart of narratives about what it means to be masculine, but also narratives about what it means to be a nation and what it means to be American. And the hero of these films, the victim hero, as I call him, can only save the day when he stops trying to be a hero and when he resigns himself to noble death, to the idea that he will give up his life to save others. So although these films do not typically have overt religious narratives in them, they often reproduce a kind of Judeo-Christian narrative of salvific sacrifice, where the sacrifice of one person, a cherished and beloved member of a community, right? The person who's sacrificed has to be of value. It can't just be anyone. It has to be someone who's important. That sacrifice can redeem the person who's made into a noble victim, but can also save those around him, right? Can redeem his community of followers and believers. And so in each of these films, the narrative crisis or trauma is resolved when the sacrificial victim hero dies in the end of the film. So if you remember Titanic, what happens to Leo? He drops into the frozen water. Exactly, yeah. Or at the end of I Am Legend, Will Smith kills himself in order to stop the spread of the plague and takes the, sorry, by the way, I'm totally always spoiling movies for people because I'm interested in the ends. But in killing himself, he also kills the infected population that's been ravaging the world. If any of you watch Walking Dead, I have very specific ideas about how that narrative is ultimately going to wrap up. But what I find interesting about this paradox is that on the one hand, I find that sacrificial films privilege particular versions of masculinity, because the sacrificial victim hero, in most cases, tends to be white, heterosexual, and able-bodied. The one exception is Will Smith, who stands out, and I can, in Q&A talk about the way that I think Will Smith's identity functions with respect to sacrifice. But for the most part, these victim heroes tend to be white, heterosexual, and able-bodied. And I think that identity is in some ways privileged through the rhetoric of sacrifice. Although that hero is killed, in his noble death, he is elevated, right, as the most important member of a community and as the only one who is capable of solving the world's crisis. But at the same time, the narrative of noble death and the rhetoric of sacrifice gets tied in our culture to the celebration of violence and the militarization of our culture, right? It's this kind of logic that leads young men, and also I think young women, to believe that it's noble to die, right, for one's country, or to die for a cause. And so I think that the cultural embrace of this logic can have material and tangible impacts on the choices that people make, and can affect not just living and dying on the big screen, but living and dying in real life. So I will stop there because I want to continue the conversation, but thanks for letting me have a moment to speak.
I'm enjoying looking at him.
Who can take down
This to the table. We expect most of the
Oh, I'm gonna present up here first before we move to, yeah, no problem. Okay, so from one sacrificial hero to another. My work, like I said, I'm an anthropologist, and my work is on the U.S. military and the everyday experiences of soldiers and military families, and the folks who share the lives of soldiers and military families, and looking at the ways that people experience war and the kind of mundane everyday labor of making war in their everyday intimate and bodily and interpersonal experiences. And this is research that is mostly based in 12 months of ethnographic fieldwork that I did at Fort Hood, this really large U.S. Army base in Central Texas, in 2007 and 2008, so right at the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so it almost goes without saying that in thinking about an area like this, that war and military life are especially in the U.S., are defined in many ways and rely in many ways on traits that are sort of stereotypically manly. So things like tolerance for pain and discomfort, strength and toughness, physical discipline, technical skill and capability, but also sort of things like the ability to suppress empathy and care, to suppress emotion, to be able to command and coerce without hesitation, to be able to lead with certainty and confidence, and perhaps most significantly of all, the ability to inflict harm and kill without hesitation or without emotion or reserve. And then finally, in the aftermath, potentially to be able to withstand the burden of traumatic experience and potentially also to bear the weight of moral taboo. So in many ways that resonate quite directly with what Professor King was just talking about, the soldier in U.S. culture very much exemplifies a lot of these notions of the sacrificing hero, in which masculinity is sort of consolidated and exemplified through its connections with violence, through the ability to both sort of exercise that violence and also through the way that it is made the victim or the damaged object of that violence. And so on the screen up here, this is the image that's to your left there is this image that's come to be known as the smoking Marine. It's a photograph from the Battle of Fallujah early in the Iraq War, and this is a young Marine private who you would not know by looking at this photograph was, I believe, 19 years old when this picture was taken, and taken in the midst of one of the bloodiest and most intense battles of the Iraq War. And this image quickly became quite incredibly iconic as a sort of representation of both the war itself and its potential impacts on the people who were being sent to fight in it. And indeed, we can look at this Marine and we can see his sort of 1,000-yard stare into some imagined point in the distance. We can see the way that he's completely coated with dirt and debris and soot. He looks, he's clearly exhausted. He has these giant dark circles under his eyes that testify to presumably a tremendous amount of fortitude and effort, and potentially also stress and fear. And he's also quite conspicuously covered with blood that might be his or might be somebody else's, but indeed for the purposes of this image of masculinity that is defined through relationship with violence, it doesn't necessarily matter. Like blood, the blood really sort of signals that relationship with violence. And so again, sort of going, thinking about Professor King's argument about the significance of images, we can think about the way that images of soldiers like this, that depict them as both agents and objects of violence, doers of violence and targets of violence, and potentially sort of victims of violence at the same time as they're elevated as heroes, says a lot about how we as a society imagine our relationship to military violence that's done in our name. And it also suggests that masculinity is an incredibly powerful and important category of mediation for thinking about that relationship. At the same time, as I'll talk about more in a second, masculinity comes to serve as an incredibly important category for how soldiers themselves think about their own embodied experiences of going to war, and also suffering from its effects and aftermath. Now, I should also just mention, especially in terms of thinking about how these images circulate in our culture more broadly, this is hardly the smoking Marine image is hardly the only point of reference that we have for thinking about soldiers and the military as a sort of special site of masculinity, because we also can see on the right-hand side of the screen this Army recruiting ad from a few years ago, in which the soldier is represented as a caring, providing father figure, and the legend, "Being proud is strong, making others proud is Army strong," links back to some of the points that Professor Griffith made a few moments ago about masculinity as very much a sort of appealing to the notion of masculinity as very much a relational phenomenon that has to do with both appropriate social roles, but also relationship to others. And so between these two images, we can also think more generally about the way that soldiers as a category are imagined as this sort of this special repository for what we might describe as manly civic and personal virtue. And this is a notion that the political scientist Aaron Belkin has described as military masculinity, which is to say this sort of portable set of values or ways of thinking about being a man or proving manhood that circulate broadly through society, not just in the military, but have the effect of, on the one hand, making the military and military imagery a sort of privileged site for thinking about manhood, and also making masculinity, like I said a moment ago, especially salient for how soldiers think about their own bodily and emotional experiences. And so that actually is the thing that I kind of want to talk about most directly in the couple of moments that I have to share some work here. So one of the things that I found in my work on folks' sort of everyday experiences of military life and what was involved in being a soldier was the way that bodily experience in all these different ways was sort of really at the center of military life and soldierly identity. There's a way that the soldier's body is sort of the most important piece of equipment for making war and for waging war. Again, thinking about its role as both the target of violence but also the instrument of violence. And soldiers sort of live in the midst of and are well accustomed to and often really strongly and positively identify with this really comprehensive regime of discipline that they're subjected to that is dedicated to crafting and shaping and developing the usefulness and productivity and also the sort of interchangeability and reliability of their bodies to be able to perform a tremendous range of different jobs that are involved in waging war, whether it's outright combat or various other kinds of sort of physical labor or performing highly technical tasks. These are very much bodily enterprises, and there's a way that being a soldier is essentially synonymous with being a particular kind of effective body. Now, that body is also a body that is that's dramatically sort of surrounded by and augmented by technology that is meant to, on the one hand, shield its vulnerabilities, and on the other hand, kind of extend its capabilities. And this is something that's really vividly exemplified with the body armor that contemporary U.S. soldiers wear, that provides a tremendous amount of protection against shrapnel and small caliber arms fire. Their other gear that they're equipped with that can help them see at night, protect them from poisonous gases. Make it possible for them to sort of operate in hostile and uncomfortable environments for long periods of time, and of course weapons and other equipment that augment their capacity to sort of monitor their environment and act on it with deadly force. And so these material elements we can think of as kind of extending and building on our existing image of the soldier as a disciplined and sort of physically enhanced body by providing this additional kind of material shell, this array of objects that kind of further reproduce that image. Now, one of the things I learned in my work that was really striking was the way that despite this image of toughness and discipline and uniformity and invulnerability and capability, soldiers frequently experience themselves as profoundly vulnerable to violence. And they sometimes even experience this indirect relationship with the material objects that were meant to protect them and shield them. So that image on the left-hand side of the screen is a body armor vest, Interceptor body armor vest. It's a conventional vest worn by U.S. forces in Iraq. And what you're actually seeing is the ceramic plate that would protect a soldier's chest that is normally inside a pocket in the front of the vest has been taken out. So that's the black object, and the green and camo fabric is the Kevlar sort of liner of the vest that those plates sit inside. These are tremendously strong and powerful materials that, in the best of circumstances, can repel shrapnel and bullets. That was clearly not the case in this instance here. This is a vest that was worn by a soldier who was exposed to a really powerful blast. I've looked at this image a bunch of times without ever really being struck by the irony of the fact that it says "handle with care" on this object that is, on the one hand, meant to withstand bomb blasts, and on the other hand, was protecting the vulnerable body of a soldier. But the fact is that these technologies that, from our perspective, may suggest the relative invulnerability of soldiers, for soldiers serve as, in many ways, sort of serve as reminders of the kind of violence that they are exposed to intentionally when they deploy and when they go to war. The image on the right-hand side of the screen is an armored Humvee that was destroyed by an IED, and it's difficult to make out some of the interior detail, but you can see pretty easily that this powerful, tough armored vehicle is just completely devastated by this bomb blast, and as were potentially the people who were riding inside of it. So, just to emphasize here the ways that this sort of connotatively tough, strong, powerful, infinitely capable, resilient, masculine body is, even in the very technologies that are meant to improve and extend and fortify it, is also sort of perpetually a vulnerable body, and open to the kinds of compromise and sacrifice and injury and even death that Professor King was describing a moment ago. Now, there's an additional, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. There are some things that we could say about sort of how then soldiers' bodies are understood when they're when they become injured, which is something I've also written a lot about and which I'd be happy to come back to in the Q&A. But I want to take my remaining couple of minutes to say a couple of words about another military health phenomenon that I've been spending a lot of time working on recently, which is the phenomenon of soldier suicide, which is something that has received a lot of attention almost since the very beginning of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as the military suicide rate, which is traditionally and historically quite lower than the civilian rate, has climbed steadily since the beginning of those conflicts, and as of several years ago, surpassed the civilian suicide rate. It's now leveled off a little bit, but it has not dropped to. It has shown no signs of dropping to its previous level, and why exactly soldiers are committing suicide and other military service members are committing suicide in such large numbers is not particularly well understood. The military and responses to this problem, as exemplified in this slide here, which comes from a 2010 Army report, are organized along fairly conventional epidemiological lines. They're understood in terms of risk factors, and risk factors of which male gender and stereotypically masculine risky behaviors, things like getting into fights, criminal offenses, drinking too much, abusing drugs, refusing to seek medical treatment, stuff like that. These are things that are frequently identified as some of the biggest risk factors for suicide in military populations, just as they potentially are in civilian populations. But the causal mechanism, or what it is that actually brings people to the point of suicide, is not terribly well understood. The conventional understanding of military suicide is that going to war, participating in combat, being exposed to traumatic circumstances, and then potentially developing a war-related mental illness like PTSD, then sort of provokes suicide. And this fits in very well with our kind of conventional cultural narrative of soldiers, again, as sort of sacrificial heroes, of being exposed to violence on purpose, doing it in this heroic and self-sacrificing capacity, and then being tragically undone by that exposure. And that certainly is the case for a certain proportion of military suicides. But the vast data that is available on this this phenomenon doesn't actually bear out that narrative particularly well. It's been very difficult for folks studying this problem to establish clear links between deployment and suicide, between multiple deployments and suicide, between PTSD diagnosis and suicide, between particular kinds of war experience and suicide. There are some sort of loose correlations, but very little sort of satisfying explanation of how one of these things leads to the next, to the next, to the next. And there's some evidence, I would argue, to at least sort of speculate that part of what is driving the effort to formulate the problem in this way is an assumption, a sort of ingrained assumption that this is how masculinity works, this is how violence works, and the fact that we already know this as a kind of common sense is driving some of the effort at suicide prevention. And so there are a couple problems we could think about here. Some of which are exemplified in diagrams like this, which organize the risk factors confronting soldiers as if they are a series of hierarchies that lead sort of directly from one to the next, so that drug and alcohol offenses are placed on the same hierarchy as using street drugs, or suicide attempts are understood in terms of their relationship with criminal offenses or things like that. But there's also just a more general effort to try to parse and separate risk factors that may not, in fact, hold up particularly well. So one of the ways that military suicide surveillance works is by saying, okay, so was the suicide work-related or was it personal? And when you're talking about a population that has, for folks who have been in the military for several years, who have spent long periods of time away from their spouses and families as they've been deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan, as they've been subjected to a huge range of work-related stresses, including the stress of being at war, but also just separation, regular challenges of military life. Just the very notion of trying to separate work-related from personal-related causes perhaps creates a sort of artificial sense of how it is that, again, thinking about both health and categories of identity as these relational and structurally embedded phenomena, presuming to kind of slice them apart in this particular way may not serve us particularly well. There's also the question of risky behaviors and the way that when risky behaviors are identified, soldiers are encouraged to sort of identify risky behaviors in one another and in their peers. And the sense of urgency around suicide, while tremendously well warranted, also has the effect of sort of meaning that these behaviors become something that the Army responds to punitively by suggesting that people need to be hospitalized or need to be carefully watched, or soldiers, say, babysat by peers if they demonstrate excessively risky behavior that may not necessarily be pre-suicidal, but becomes important once because it has been associated in this logic with suicide. And so this is also something that came up in interesting ways. The image on the left is a sort of public service announcement card. It's like a wallet-sized card. These are a tremendously common phenomenon in military settings. In this case, it's one that advertises suicide intervention steps, and it uses a lot of this sort of masculinized rhetoric of comradeship and the idea of your watching out for your buddy, your battle buddy, if he's demonstrating signs that he might be at risk for suicide. And so there are also interesting ways that military rhetoric itself is being mobilized to encourage soldiers to think about health in particular ways. And so that actually kind of leads to the question that I'll conclude with, which is this question of whether appeals to given what we know about regular soldierly experience, about the ways that military masculinity is represented in our society, do these sorts of appeals to masculinity and warrior identity and so forth are they effective? And this is not a rhetorical question. It's an empirical question that I think merits really careful and curious investigation. Do they potentially recreate some of the problems that they are seeking to address and that are producing distress in soldiers in the first place? And to what extent do they allow for or preclude the possibility of critiquing the structures that are giving rise to that are potentially giving rise to this phenomenon of soldier suicide? There's a lot more that I would love to say about all this, but I will conclude here for now, and I think now we can open the floor to questions and discussion. Yes.
Good question. My name is Emily. I'm an MPH student here in the Global Health track. And this wasn't discussed as directly, but I was kind of interested in the sex and gender differences in parenting and pregnancy and the impact that might have on men's engagement with health. As women reach childbearing age, they tend to develop a more direct relationship with their doctor. They tend to be more responsible for taking their children to the doctor or to the hospital. And there's this kind of social ideology that your body is no longer about yourself, but it's about your children and your family. And men don't seem to fall into that same category. So I guess I was just curious if there was any research on whether the differences in parenting impacted health outcomes or health engagement.
I can give this a shot. So men developing an identity as a father does actually have a relationship to how they start to think about their health and think about themselves very differently. And so if you think about, again, sort of what I started talking about in terms of this relational notion of masculinity, and having children really is something that men often see as a particularly important source of motivation for them to do things that are healthy or do things better, do things so that they will be there for their kids and be healthy for their kids and so forth. So it may not have quite the direct relationship that it does with women in terms of taking better care of their bodies and so forth in quite the same way, but in terms of thinking about more sacrificial sort of ways of, I need to focus on making sure that I do things that leave a legacy for my kids, or in some ways you can sometimes, or there are efforts now to sort of utilize that relationship or utilize that opportunity to get men to really rethink how they think about their bodies and health as a particularly important time to sort of maximize that opportunity to motivate them to change how they think about, some of the things that they wouldn't have necessarily prioritized before in terms of taking care of their health, going to the doctor, engaging in healthier behavior just in general.
Yes, please.
First, I would like to, in case there are some soldiers, veterans, I would like to thank them because we owe our freedom to the soldiers. And I am the son of two veterans. And my birth follows the death of a child, a son that did not live at birth. And my research has led me to think that my prenatal life was on death row, death chamber. And after I was born, I went back to study the things that I feel that I'm suffering from today. And I say all of that to say this. I believe that as men today, we are suffering from a lack of understanding of our fathers, of our mothers. My mother had me against her will to help my father get over the son that he lost. So when I listened to the two stories, I actually sided with my mother. We left me in the conclusion that as men today, we are suffering from the lack of understanding of our fathers, of our mothers, and when we get a better understanding of this, our health will improve.
Okay.
Well, thank you for that. I'm sure that that actually in the context of the discussion we've been having thus far, I imagine all of our panelists would agree that things like kinship and our sense of personal history and also our capacity to create narratives about that history are also are certainly crucial aspects of how we think about health and how we elect to define it. Thank you, Laura.
I just wanted to follow up on the issue of the stereotypical movement of male behavior as resulting in negative health outcomes. And I just wanted to ask you to comment on possibly the good outcomes of stereotypically male behavior as well, like playing sports and getting exercise, having confidence, these sorts of things. And just maybe to talk a bit about how scholars in this area of work think about the issue of gender and sexuality, so women, what happens in terms of health isolated through.
Sure. To some.
Okay, so you had rule number one with me is I can't do multiple parts of questions, so I'll forget. I forgot some parts of this already. as far as sort of the more positive aspects of sort of male behavior, and seeing that as also an embodiment of masculinity, as opposed to only thinking masculinity in negative terms. There's just generally this idea of positive deviance, where you're looking at sort of, who are the outliers in sort of a positive sense, and how do you utilize sort of what you learn from them, what you get from them, and in a way that you might be able to translate that to other people. And so there is an effort to sort of think about how that would actually relate, to trying to encourage, for example, other men to engage in similar sort of behavior, as well as if you think about some of the pieces I was talking about in terms of peer sort of social norms, that also would sort of fit within that larger picture of, it's not always just thinking about peer norms in a negative sense, but peer norms also, in a positive sense, that you can have these peers that can be that source of actually corrective behavior, or at least, continue to support you engaging in healthier behavior, versus always it being something where, male norms being always sort of negative.
And I guess I'd also echo that that sort of reluctance to just kind of completely pathologize or define only in negative terms. And I think actually that's one of the that's one of the sort of interesting questions about to return to the kind of the original provocation of why study men and why study men's health. That part of it is an opportunity to, for one thing, potentially to define masculinity and masculine behaviors and practices in ways that are not automatically linked to maleness. And so that's, especially working in military settings, this is something that that comes up all the time. The sort of the mobility and portability of connotatively masculine practices across lines of gender and sexual difference, and so thinking about and so that that has an interesting and destabilizing effect on our sense of sort of what is not just what is or isn't healthy, but also what is or isn't properly male or masculine, and so I guess a thing that I keep coming back to in my work is the way that in military settings, for instance, the sort of the rhetoric of effective and successful male embodiment is something that, to go back to what Derek mentioned earlier, the idea of masculinity is something that you have to constantly perform, and that you are also potentially constantly at risk of failing. And so it does provide a tremendous number of sort of positive standards for success and self-identification and stuff like that, but it also, certainly in that institutional context, and I think in plenty of other sort of social and cultural contexts, it is so rife with opportunities for failure that that actually an interesting provocation of your question is to think about the extent to what would be our are there ways that we can talk about sort of gendered health behaviors that are descriptive without being pathologizing, because our sense of gender may in fact be so profoundly interwoven with our ideas about health and sort of correct conduct and normative behavior that I think that's actually a really interesting challenge for us to sort of push at a little bit.
But if I can just piggyback off that a little bit from a probably very different perspective, but in thinking about the study of gender and sexual identifications with an interest in non-normative identities, this notion of failure can actually be a really valuable resource. So scholars in queer theory, for instance, are interested in the idea of thinking about not just the opportunities for failure, but to think about failure as an opportunity. So to think about these ways in which individuals don't live up to hegemonic masculine ideals can be a way, on the one hand, to call attention to the artificiality and the performative nature of those ideals, right? To denaturalize them such that that their hegemony can be displaced to make room for other iterations of masculinity, right? So failure itself doesn't have to be pathologized in that particular way.
Julia?
About the second project, it says you want to study on race and gender.
I was curious, in that instance, where we're looking at two variables, given the conclusions you reached seem to suggest that social and environmental factors were a stronger determinant than behavioural ones, it sort of re-raised the question to me, why focus exclusively on that instance? Because presumably the problems of actually with race, as you know, Latino African American men, different outcomes based on socioeconomic factors, and you mentioned concern about prejudice. Those seem to, I can't remember what there were listed four that were primary, but those struck me as being ones that didn't exclusively affect men. So I was just wondering whether that then opens up the question in that instance of why this is a specifically men's health problem rather than a problem for say, non-white women as well.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, so that's a really important, it's a really important topic. I think that you're right in that many of those factors, all those factors that I listed that are in our study also affect the lives of women, right? And so we might find some similar findings among women. And I've actually run parallel analyses of among women. So this is one study, and so part of a larger study that does look at both. I will say that the factors and the predictive validity of some of these conditions do differ by gender, and the prevalence of some of these conditions and factors, such as discrimination, differ by gender and by race. And I think Derek has done some work, and we've talked about some studies that have shown that, for instance, our measures themselves are gendered. So some of our race measures are in fact gendered. So the typical everyday discrimination measure, which is sort of the gold standard, it's what people use, most widely used measure, is in fact gendered, although it presents itself as race neutral, but in fact it better captures the experiences of men than it does women. And so the types of discriminatory actions that they ask about oftentimes are just more relevant to men's lives. So things about being policed in public spaces and being presumed guilty and things of that nature, and people being fearful of you. These things are actually fit the experiences of men much more so than they do women. And it doesn't necessarily mean that men experience greater levels of discrimination. That is not what we're applying. But some of these measures do fit. And so there have been empirical analyses that examine the fit of these indices. And they seem to fit, these measures that are presented as race or gender neutral are in fact gendered. And so, we chose to focus on men in this study, primarily because it's an understudied topic. And so sometimes, in a larger project, we're looking at men and women. But sometimes, there's been very few studies looking at health disparities just among men, right? And especially looking at men of color. And so we're arguing that they face unique challenges to health. So they face a number of unique barriers to health. And so when we actually do combine the different genders and the different racial and ethnic groups, we see that. And so on a number of indices, men of color are in fact doing worse off, especially certain discrimination measures, right? And so, it just goes to whether or not you want to take, an intercategorical approach or an intra-categorical approach. And we here are sort of doing a little bit of a balance, right? So it's intra in that we're just looking at men, and it's inter in that we're looking at across races, right? And so a large intercategorical would be across race and gender. And you can make a case for studying within groups too, right? And so you can get at some of the unique challenges. But ultimately, I think you're right. And the experiences of women is actually what I've been studying for the last 3 or 4 years. And so your point is well taken.
Well, and so I'm really saddened by the fact that we're basically at time. But I think this last question and Professor Brown's remarks sort of bring us back to some of the conundrums of labeling and categorization that seem to be inherent to some of the questions that we're trying to ask today, where categories themselves may be the source of a lot of the problems that we're trying to solve, and yet we also, of course, cannot do without them in our efforts to try to address and objectify those problems.
Can you say one thing?
Yeah, please.
This is a little bit of an aside, shameless plug. I had the fortune of actually working on the Tennessee Men's Health Report Card, And Tennessee is actually one of the few states that actually has a regular report card that actually chronicles and captures the health of men in the state, looking across a number of dimensions. If you have any interest in that, we actually have copies in the back. I'm very fortunate that a former student, Brent Davis, is here. He can certainly talk about it. Mike Leventhal, who was on our advisory board, Claire Sullivan, who was also a key part of it, is also here as well. So just wanted you to know that that's available to you in the back as you're leaving. Sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much.